Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In this tutorial I want to show you everything that you need to know to get started with texture painting in Blender. Now I'm really sorry, I've been MIA for quite a while. There's been some really big life changes that also mean that there's very little time for YouTube at the moment. So my choices right now are either release a whole lot less content, like one video every couple of months, because I usually spend 20 to 40 hours editing every single video, or release content that's a little bit more raw, a little bit less edited. So there's likely going to be a little bit more waffle in this tutorial, just because I'm going to leave some stuff in to make the editing part a little bit easier. However, as always, you will find timestamps to everything down in the video description, so you can jump to anywhere in this tutorial that you might find interesting. I'm going to try to cover all of the basics: how to set up your models for texture painting, how to use the brush tools, how to use texture masks and stencils. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the common problems that you might encounter when you're just getting started with texture painting in Blender. Now, do note that I will assume that you are familiar with the basics of how Blender works. If you're just brand new to Blender, you've never really used the program before, I've got a completely free beginner course on my website that you can go and check out. Link to that down in the video description. It's about 3 hours of training and it takes you through all of the basics for Blender. And then this tutorial will show you how to do texture painting. Now, because the format of this video is going to be slightly different and a little bit less edited, I'm really keen for your feedback on whether you like this sort of content. It just allows me to produce more content rather than, a couple of videos every year. So please leave all of your comments, any questions and suggestions you have as well down below. But now enough waffle, let's jump into Blender and finally get started. Here we are in Blender, and just a note, I'm currently using version 3.3, but most of the stuff I show you here should work in version 2.8 or later. However, there's been some changes to the workspaces and some of the UI throughout the month and years of Blender development, so make sure you have 3.3 or later. You shouldn't have a problem following along. Now, first and foremost, if you are getting stuck, like you can't paint or something doesn't quite work the way it does in this tutorial, be sure to come up into your File, Defaults, and make sure you select to load factory settings. This will simply reset any brush masks or other settings that you might have enabled either deliberately or accidentally via a shortcut key that might make this not work the same way. I've got everything reset to default. And for this tutorial, we're going to use this Pokeball right here. As always, you'll be able to grab this file from our website, and the download link to this will be down in the video description. So you just grab that and you'll have this file right here. Now, as you can see, this Pokeball already has a couple of materials assigned to them. And in my outliner, you can see I actually have two objects. I have the Pokeball itself, and I have this Pokeball details object. If I hide that for a second, that's just really those little details that I've added on using a plugin called Random Flow, which I might make another tutorial, and it's really cool. You can add some really nice things to your model. So just wanted to add a little bit more detail to make it look a little bit more interesting. Let's hide the Pokeball details for now, and let's talk about how to actually paint textures onto your 3D models. Now, in Blender, the easiest way to do texture painting is to use the texture painting workspace, and you'll find that at the top bar here. We're right now on the layout workspace. If you come over to the right hand side and select texture paint, you're going to jump into the texture paint workspace. Over on the right hand side, everything is gray at the moment, and I also noticed that in the outliner, can you see how this little paintbrush icon is actually on my Pokeball details, which is hidden? You want to make sure that you actually click on this little dot next to the item you want to paint. We want to paint the Pokeball because the Pokeball details is hidden. So make sure that that brush is actually active on the object that you want to paint on. The reason that happened is if you return to the layout workspace, we had the Pokeball details selected. So if you select the Pokeball details and with that object selected, you go to texture paint, Blender will assume that you want to texture paint that particular object, and that's the one that's enabled for painting. But we want to paint on Pokeball, so make sure that paintbrush sits on that object. And right now it shows as pink because we don't actually have any textures assigned per se. Now, if you go to Material Preview or Rendered View, you can see there's materials. However, those materials don't have any textures, any image data that you can actually paint into. In fact, with the Pokeball selected, come into the Material tab. Let's make this just a little bit bigger. And I have three materials on this Pokeball right now. One called Pokeball Top. You can see it's just a really simple Principled BSDF with a red color, Pokeball Bottom, which is gray, and the Pokeball Ring, which is black. But there are no image textures. This is really just pretty plain materials. So let's return to Solid View. Make sure you're still in texture paint mode and that paintbrush icon is on the Pokeball. And if I now click and drag on this Pokeball to paint, look at the bottom, there's an error coming, missing textures detected. It's because, well, I don't have any textures assigned to any part of my 3D model that I could actually paint. In the Properties panel, let's return to the Tool settings. And in here, while you're in texture paint mode, you actually have the options to define how you want to paint. So in here, there's a number of texture slots and a mode, which right now is set to material. If you pop this open, you can actually decide whether to paint onto a material on your 3D object. I'd recommend always go with this one. It's likely the one that you want. So this allows you to paint on the base color, the specularity, the metallicness, the roughness, bump mapping. You can paint individual layers of your material onto your 3D model. It's super useful. If you select single image, you actually can select a target image you want to paint onto. Whether that image is assigned to a material somewhere in your scene is totally separate. So I highly recommend material is much easier. Now let's select Pokeball top material right here. And well, this material doesn't have any texture, so there's nothing for me to paint on. However, what I can do is under no textures, I can click on plus and select base color. So I'm now saying I want to add an image texture, and I want that image texture to become the base color input on my Pokeball top material. So let's click plus, select base color. Let's call this top base color. Width and height right now is 1024 by 1024. I recommend if you want more detail in your textures, jack this up. I usually like to go with somewhere around 4000. Do note that that does make your texture painting slower though. Now you can decide to enable alpha or not, so it's going to have an alpha channel. I don't really need it because I'm not going to paint on transparency, so let's disable that. It just saves a little bit of memory. You can generate a certain image to start off with. I kind of want to start with blank, but you can also generate a UV grid or a color grid, so your image will have a texture, like there'll be something in that image by default. But let's just go with blank. Color, yeah, like some darkish red, just what we'd expect the top of a Pokeball to be. Maybe just a little bit desaturated. That all looks good. Let's hit OK. And immediately you see that red color now shows in our texture painting workspace on the top of the Pokeball. If you go back to the Materials tab, on this Pokeball top material, you can now see that the base color here, if you expand this, actually comes from our top base color texture image that we've just defined. So this texture image that we've defined now gets fed into this material, and therefore we can paint on it. If you come over into the shading view, or the shading workspace actually, and you have this Pokeball top material selected, you can now actually see how we've got this top base color image defined, and that color flows into the base color of our principled BSDF. So that's kind of the base setup that you're essentially setting up through that texture workspace. Let's return to the texture paint workspace. And on the left-hand side, let's zoom out by scrolling down on our mouse wheel. This is now actually our texture. You can see that at the top here, this selected the top base color texture that we've just created. And over on the right-hand side, if you now click and drag, you can actually now paint on this image. And as you let go, you can see that texture or that paint appearing on the left-hand side. You can also click and paint on the left side, and that will reflect over on your 3D model. Now, there's two things that might happen. The first one that's going to happen when you're using my tutorial file is that you're getting this weird mirrored effect. Now, that might be what you want. It's probably not. The reason that is happening is because I used a mirror modifier when I created this 3D object. But when you're downloading something from the internet, your 3D object may not even have a UV map, which means Blender doesn't actually know how to map the 3D geometry of your model to a two-dimensional image. So let's fake that for the moment. Let's undo this with Ctrl or Command and Z. And by the way, there's shortcut keys being blended in the middle of the interface, just in case, like even though they show, people still ask me, hey, what button are you pressing? You should be able to see that at the bottom of the interface. So let's undo that. Make sure you have the Pokeball selected. Come down here into the Object Data Properties, expand UV Maps. In here, you'll find the existing UV map on this Pokeball, and let's delete it. So that now deleted the UV map. The texture has vanished because Blender now doesn't know, well, how does this texture even map to this 3D object? And if you come back into the tool settings, click and draw, you're going to get an error saying missing UVs detected. And that's because this 3D model has no UVs. Blender doesn't know how this maps to a texture, and therefore you can't really paint on it. So in order to fix that with the Pokeball selected, press Tab to go into edit mode with the cursor over the 3D view. So that's now our 3D object. Press A to select everything. Come up into the UV options in your menu bar. And by the way, if you can't see these, a lot of people just have the interface so small, it's like there's no UV setting. It's because you can't see it. So make sure your workspace, your 3D view is big enough so you should be able to see UVs. And then in here, select Smart UV Project. That's simply going to unwrap your 3D object, like an origami piece of paper, and flatten it out. So let's select that. UV Project. hit OK. And now on the left-hand side, you should be able to see the UV map of your 3D object laid out. If you return to the object data properties, we have our UV map back. So we just generated this new UV map that tells Blender how this 3D model maps to a 2D image. If I talk too much, again, there's timestamps, so you can skip all of my waffling, but I want to be very thorough with how I explain this because people get stuck so much in this texture painting workflow, or they get errors with a model that they've got off a video game or downloaded from the internet. I want to show you how exactly you can fix that and why that is happening to begin with. So let's return to the tool settings. Also, here's another thing that gets people caught out. If you can't see these UVs on the left-hand side here, let's expand this a little bit. Make sure you come into these overlays options here and you enable display texture paint UVs. If you disable that, those UVs will vanish. So let's enable that. Also, the UVs will only show for the selected geometry. So right now I have everything selected, but if I press AA to unselect everything, my UVs will vanish. It's just because, well, I have nothing selected. If I only select the top part of this Pokeball, only the UVs for my selected geometry in edit mode will show. So if that doesn't show, it's likely because you've unselected your object. So let's select everything again, press tab to come back into texture paint mode. Also at the top here in your 3D view, make sure that you are in texture paint mode. If you go into object mode accidentally, again, your UVs will vanish and you can't actually paint because you're no longer in texture paint mode. Happens more often than you think. So make sure you are in texture paint mode. And now if you click and drag, we can now properly paint onto this top part of our Pokeball, which is really cool. So you can now draw whatever pattern you want on there. And again, it shows on the left-hand side. And because you now have UVs really nicely laid out, you can also come in here and paint on very specific parts of your image. You can also export this image, take it to the Photoshop, then add textures or whatever and bring it back in. And then that texture will map to your model. Again, you're kind of not using texture painting there, but it's a nice workflow to just assign very specific colors or textures or materials to part of your 3D model. Now let's talk about brush options and brush settings that you can do to make painting a little bit more interesting rather than just painting boring white onto your 3D objects. The other thing I also want to do is that when you're downloading a model from the internet, you may not have materials on it just yet. So what I'm going to do for the next part, let's go into the materials tab and let's delete this Pokemon bottom and this Pokeball ring material. So now the only material on our 3D object is this Pokeball top material. But let's say we now want to paint this bottom here specifically. Now I can paint onto the same material for my top, but it would be nice if this was a separate material just so we can adjust its metallicness or its properties differently. The other thing I might actually want to do anyways with this Pokeball top, well actually you know what, let's undo that so we don't see it. On the Pokeball top material, let's come down a little bit. What I might actually do is I might actually bring down the roughness and up the specularity a little bit. And I'm also going to jump over into material preview so I get this really nice shiny effect so I can see a little bit better what that looks like. Now I don't want the bottom to be quite so shiny, so we do need a different material. Now if you return to the active tool settings, and in here I now can't actually select individual materials anymore because there's only one material on this object, so there's nothing here to select. So in the materials tab, let's create a new material slot. Let's create a new material. Let's call this one bottom, with the cursor over the 3D view tab to go into edit mode. Let's unselect everything. Let's select the face on the bottom and Control or Command and L to select all linked faces, all linked geometry. So let's select all of that. Select the bottom material, hit assign to assign that. Let's tab back out of that. That looks a little bit better. So the top is really shiny. The bottom is a little bit more flat. Now if I return to the active tool settings, I can see my two materials again in here. And my bottom, again on the top one, I've got this base color image that I can paint on. On the bottom, I have nothing to paint on. So if I click and drag, it may look like nothing happens, but can you see how there's something white that appeared here? And that's because when you paint in texture paint mode, you're actually going to paint on all materials at the same time. Now it's a little bit confusing, so let's actually set this up first properly. So Control or Command and Z to undo all of that. With the bottom material slot selected, let's click plus, hit base color. This is called bottom base color, 4000 by 4000. Yep, let's leave all of that on default. Maybe I'll make it just a little bit darker, hit OK. So now I have an image assigned here, click and drag. So now I can paint on the bottom. Now I can't see that on the left hand side here because on the left hand side I've still got my top base color layer selected. So you can either click on this and select the bottom base color image, and then you can see the one for the base. The other thing you can do as well is with the material selected, so if I select the Pokeball top, go into edit mode and come back out, that's going to change my image to that image that's assigned. So that switches that back to top base color. Go back to the bottom, tap in and out, and then on the left hand side I can see my bottom base color. Now this all looks pretty ugly, but hopefully the basic flow makes sense to you. Let's return to the materials tab. Let's add another material slot. Let's create a new material. Let's call this one ring. I'm actually going to make this black like that. Give it a bit of metallicness, high specularity, and lower the roughness. So that's just going to be for the ring here. So let's go into edit mode. AA, unselect everything, select the face on the ring, and maybe a couple here on these faces on the front and at the back, just to have a bit of geometry selected. Control L to select all connected geometry. That looks all right. Select the ring material, hit assign to assign that, tap to go back out of that, and that's not too bad. Maybe I'll lower the roughness just a little bit more, specularity up and metallicness up, so that looks all right. So if I now return to texture paint mode, on the ring material here, you can see on the bottom I've got the base Pokeball top, I've got the top one, ring has no textures yet, so again let's add a base color image. Let's keep that at black, hit OK. And now I can paint on this as well. Now one thing that actually happens is that in texture paint mode, if you paint on your 3D model, you can kind of paint over all materials at the same time. And that's not always what you want. What if you wanted to add, you just wanted to paint the upper edge of this ring here without it bleeding on the top? Let's undo those two paint strokes. And the easiest way to do this is by using paint masks. So let's select some geometry that we want to paint on. So go into edit mode by pressing tab. The ring's already selected because we've assigned a material to it. Let's press AA to unselect everything. And now you could either select some faces and Control and L to select that linked geometry, but let's unselect all of that. Go back to the materials, select the ring material, hit select. So you're just going to select the geometry that material is assigned to. One thing I really love to do is I like to create vertex group for these face selections, because I might have, like a couple of faces selected here very specifically for a logo or a certain area of a 3D model, and I just want to paint that. So the easiest thing you can actually do, let's actually come up here to the top. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select this top ring here, and maybe the next one out. And let's create a vertex group just for that. So let's come into the object data properties. Under vertex groups, press plus. Let's call this one top ring. And with the faces selected, hit assign. Let's press AA to unselect everything. And now this top ring vertex group, if you click select, you can reselect it quite easily without it being associated with where you've got a material assigned or not. And it makes it really easy if you've got certain areas of your model that you want to select. So with these faces selected now, press tab to come back into texture paint mode. And on the top panel, you've got an option here to select or to enable a paint mask. If you enable this, this will essentially block everything from being painted on except for the selected faces. Again, tap to edit mode, so now we can only paint on these selected faces. If I now click and drag, I can now only paint on the faces that I've got selected. Tap back out. See, now I've only painted that top part. Let's disable the paint mask again. And now I've really just painted on the faces at the top, and it makes it really nice and easy. So for example, let's say I only want to paint the edge of this ring. So let's go into edit mode, select an edge of this ring, or go into materials, select the ring material, hit select. Let's actually go into vertex groups as well and create a ring vertex group, hit assign on that, tap out again, and make sure you select the paint mask at the top. And again, you can see I can now only paint on the selected geometry. So if we can paint on that, and we can get a really nice clean edge here at the top, disable the paint mask. And you can see I've only painted the selected objects. Now I've messed everything up pretty good, and you can go into the left side here, select your top layer, for example. On the texture draw, click on this color swatch here on the left hand side, on this white color picker, select the base color again. And you can now, kind of go over and clean all of this up. That's pretty painful. What you can do as well, you can also come up into image, and if you haven't saved your file just yet, you can select reload. That's just going to reload the current image back from disk. So I haven't saved my file yet, so I can go reload. That's just going to reload the image that I had at the base or when I started out. Let's select the bottom image, reload, and the ring as well, image, reload. So now we've kind of cleared those materials back out again, but now I'm going to go Control and S to save my project. Usually do that quite often actually. And let's talk about a few of the brush settings that you have available, so you're not just painting, really boring strokes. So let's return to the active tool. And we've talked about texture slots plenty. Let's come down into the brushes. Now here you have a number of different brush settings. So there's a blend mode, a radius, and a strength. So right now my radius is pretty small. You can jack this up and you get a much bigger radius right here. You can also press F and just drag in or out to change that radius much more fluently. It works much better. You also have a strength, which is the opacity of your brush. So one is fully opaque, 10% opacity it'll paint a whole lot less opaque. What I might actually do, let's change my color here to black. F, make that a bit smaller, click and drag. So you can see this is pretty faint. If I jack the strength up, click and drag, you can see the strength makes that brush more opaque. In order to adjust the brush strength, Shift and F, and you can adjust the opacity from fully solid to kind of fade it out. So that's kind of a nice way to adjust those. The blend mode controls how the color is added on top of the color that already exists in your image. Right now, Mix just adds it into this, like if you're painting on a piece of paper, the new color simply gets mixed in with what is already there. But there's quite a few number of different modes. But for that, let's talk about the color picker first, because right now both of my colors, my primary and my secondary, are set to black, which isn't very useful. So let's click on the left one. Let's bring that back up to white. The one on the right is your secondary color. Let's just change that from black to maybe like a kind of a bluish color. And by the way, in order to paint with either color, left click gives you the primary color. It's a bit faint, so Shift and F. Let's jack the opacity back up to 1. Click and draw. So you can draw with your primary color. Control, left click and draws with the secondary color. So I get a secondary color and I can switch between the two really nice and easily. Now the blend mode controls how these colors are being added. Right now it's set to mix. If you change this over to, for example, additive, let's paint with our secondary color. So this is now painting with blue, but in a additive blend mode. Can you see how that's kind of just lightening the color? It's not as solid. So there's lots of options here. Play with them, try them all out, or subtract, for example. Again, let's paint. You can see how that's now kind of making it a bit darker again. So there's lots of options to paint and play with here, whatever you want. Now, a really cool feature is the color palette. So sometimes when you change, you may paint with more than 2 colors. You may want to save them. You may want to remember them without having to use the color picker to then pick them off somewhere from your model. So you have this really cool color palette. Under here, you can go new. Let's add a new palette. And then under here, you can simply add new colors. Plus, we'll simply add your primary color, which right now is white, to this palette. So if I click, I've got a white tab here. Let's just switch the white and the blue by clicking this little rotating arrow icon here. So now my primary and secondary have switched. Plus, now I've saved that as well. But maybe let's change it to a green, hit plus. So now I've got a new color, plus, and then I can reselect those colors just by clicking on my color palette. It just makes it really nice and easy to remember the colors that you were working with. But let's change these over again. So white is my primary color. Let's expand the advanced options here. And there's only 2 options in here right now. Effect alpha, whether you're painting on the alpha channel, if your image has one, so you can paint things like transparency, if you've got your shaders and everything set up that way. But you also have this option for accumulate. Now what accumulate does, let me make the brush a little bit bigger, Shift and F, and lower the opacity just a little bit, to maybe 30% or something. Accumulate is disabled. So if I now click and draw, and I draw over the same spot, it doesn't get any darker. With a single stroke, I can only lay down 30% of opacity at most. Let's undo that. Let's enable accumulate. And if I now click and draw, can you see how that's getting much, much darker? So the paint essentially layers on top of each other until you reach maximum opacity. Now my blend mode is set to subtract, so that looks a little bit funky. Let's enable or set it to mix. Let's undo that. Click and draw. And you can kind of see how that works much more solidly. Maybe I'll lower the opacity to something really faint. But now if I paint multiple times over the same area, can you see how that builds up? So the paint just accumulates, and that's what this option does. Let's again undo that, disable accumulate, collapse advanced. There's texture. Now texture essentially assigns a texture to your brush, so you're painting with that image and you're painting the colors from that image. It's kind of like a projector blowing light through an image onto your canvas and you're painting that image on. We'll get to that in just a minute, so let's collapse that first. Texture mask is kind of a stencil. Again, it's an image on your brush, but rather than transferring color from that image onto your 3D model, it's just a kind of like a grayscale to say whether you can or can't paint on certain areas. So this is really just a mask that defines which areas you can paint on. Again, we'll get to that in just a minute. Now, stroke is super useful. So right now, if I make my brush a little bit smaller and I just click and draw, and maybe I'll undo that and make my opacity a bit bigger to 1. Let's draw. This gives me a solid stroke. However, I can define the spacing. I can break this up so that I kind of get a dotted line or a dashed line, or, there's lots of nice options. So if I increase the spacing to maybe 100%, if I'll click and draw, this now gets broken up. Now there's lots of other options you can have, airbrushed lines, curves, dash ratios, jitter. You can introduce all sorts of things. But again, a nice way to, if you just want to kind of add some detail and you don't really want to, like click a million times to create these dots or dashes or lines, it's a super useful feature. The next one, or the last one in the brush settings that I really want to touch on, is Falloff. So right now, if you click and paint, oh yeah, this is useful. And this is why sometimes it's really useful to just come in here and say, defaults load factory settings, because you may have some funky stuff set up in here. So let me just reset that to default value, undo, and that looks a little bit better. So let's make the brush a little bit bigger. Click and draw. And there's a certain fallout. Can you see there's like a softness on the edge here of the brush? I think Photoshop calls this brush hardness. So you can define how hard the edge of the brush is. So right now, this is defined by this nice curve here. And you can simply click on these points and adjust them. So I can say, give it a really harsh edge. So if I now come in here, click and draw. Can you see how the front is like really sharp, but then it softens out towards the edge? I can also go the other way. Kind of make like a really harsh edge in here. Click and draw. And now I get a really hard edge. There's a whole bunch of options in here as well, so it can go sharper. So if you don't want to define them yourself, there's some smooth fall-offs, some constants, inverse, like a whole bunch of options for how that brush falls off. Again, this gives you more control over exactly how that brush is being applied to your 3D model. Let me just undo most of that. And let's clean up this top here. It looks pretty horrible. So let's come back to the top base layer. I can see where I've painted here. Now I'm going to go a slower route. Just select some color with this color picker. Increase my brush size, make sure my opacity is 1. You can just click and draw over these ones to kind of kill that off. Actually, on my Falloff, I might also reset this one. You can actually just right click and select reset to default value or hit backspace. It just resets it to what it was. And then you may need to select to reset curve to select that curve back to its default setting as well. So that looks pretty good. So if we kind of cleaned that up, let's come back into the active tools if you're not already on it. And let's talk about texture. So let's come in here just a little bit. And let's say we want to paint an image like a stencil onto the 3D object. So under texture, let's click on this. There's no texture to select. We haven't created one yet. So let's create a new texture for our brush. Let's hit new, click into the name, and let's call this one Meow. We've got cats. I love cats. So, that's likely going to be cat related. And if you click and draw, you can't paint anymore. And if you think that's just because I've got red selected, let's select green, paint. I can't paint because I've got this texture. If you clear this texture, click and see, I can paint. But if I again reselect this texture, I can't paint anymore. And again, this is another thing that a lot of people trip over where they say I can't paint. It's because they either have a texture or a texture mask assigned that doesn't allow them to. So let's undo that again. And let's actually load the texture. For that, you actually need to come into the properties panel to the very bottom here, into this texture tab. Up at the top, under your brush, there's a number of textures you can select. Right now, we've only got one texture called Meow. Now, the type you can change to whatever you want. It can be a movie, it can be clouds, distorted noise. So let's, for example, select clouds. That's going to essentially set this texture to be your Meow texture. If you return to the active tool, come down to where we have texture, our texture is now a cloud texture. And if I click and draw, I'm now drawing the pattern of that texture. Now, because the texture is only white and black, I'm actually transferring the green color through wherever it's white. Let me undo that again, and let's use something a bit more interesting. So let's go back to texture, change our type from clouds over to image or movie, hit open, and let me jump in. Where do I have it? I've got it under textures. There's a cute cat image. Let's hit open. That's this cute cat image here. And if you now Again, let's come back to the active tool so you can see this a bit better. Come down to texture. This now should load your cute cat. And if you click and draw, you are now painting this cat image on. It's green because my base color is green. So let's undo that. Let's reselect our white color, or just make sure this is fully white. So this looks good. If you now click and draw, you're now painting this cat image on, which looks really cute. Now it kind of gets squished because you're painting this image on and it's tiled to where you're applying the brush, so it looks a little bit wonky. However, you can control how this image is applied to your model. Right now the mapping is set to tiled. You can set it to come from the view plane, so if I click and draw, this is essentially, you just want to click once with your mouse because you're literally painting it every single time you move the brush. So let's undo all of those again. View plane. Tiled you've seen before. 3D is essentially a ginormous 3D shape. So this essentially uses the UV map of your 3D object to kind of map that texture out. So that's kind of just how this aligns onto our Pokeball. It kind of looks cute, kind of works. You know, it's just kind of resting on top right there. That's actually pretty cute. But let's undo that again as well. Come in. Mapping. You can set it to random, which really is, you know, like you're really spraying it around. And this is great if you want to add scratches or dirt or paint other things that you want to have randomly dispersed over your texture. Let's undo that. And the last one, and I use this one the most, is called Stencil. Now, with Stencil selected, if you hover over the 3D view, you can see the stencil down here at the bottom. And what actually happens is if I click and paint, I can't actually paint because I actually need to move my view so that my 3D object is over this stencil and I can then stencil this cat on. However, it's kind of silly to move the 3D object over the stencil, so you can actually move the stencil. So if you right click onto the stencil, you can move it around and drag it in your 3D view, so you can align it where you want it. If you hold down Shift and right click and drag out and in, you can scale it up or down. Control or Command, right click and drag, you can rotate it. So let's rotate the cat a little bit. Shift, right click and drag in to scale it down. So we can align our stencil with wherever we want this to sit. I can paint a cat on right there. So now I've painted this cute cat on. Let's paint one on the other side, and I'm going to rotate this one the other way. Control, right click, well, or Command if you're on a Mac, right click and drag. So now let's paint a cat on here. So now I've painted 2 cat stencils on my 3D object. And this is super useful if you want to add tattoos or wounds or, you know, logos or text or anything that you've got created in another image program. Just load it as a texture and just paint it on your 3D object. So that is one nice thing. Let's just remove this texture, close this. And so now if I click and draw, I can just draw freely again. Let's come down and let's expand texture mask. Now texture mask kind of works the same as texture, except you're not transferring color. Texture mask works pretty much the same way, except it limits where you can paint. So let's select texture mask. Let's just use the same image called meow. Let's come in here. And again, the mapping is set to tiled right now. Let's again set that to stencil. I can see it down here at the bottom. And can you see it's actually black? It's kind of actually got this outline happening right there. And if you right click the stencil and drag, it doesn't do anything. And this is really confusing in Blender, that the shortcut keys for moving a texture mask stencil is different from moving a texture stencil. Now, the reason these shortcut keys are different is because you can both use a texture and a texture mask simultaneously, and you may want to place them independently from one another so that your texture mask defines where you paint, the texture defines what you're painting with, and you can do both at the same time. So the shortcut keys for those two are slightly different. So what you need to do is hold down Alt or Option, right click, and then you can drag it. So let's drag it there. Hold down Alt or Option and Shift, right click and scale it. So essentially in addition to the normal shortcut keys, you also need to hold down Alt or Option, or hold down Control or Command on the Mac, Alt and Option on the Mac, right click, and then you can rotate it. So let me just shrink this down a little bit and zoom in. And if I now, again, with the white paint color, click and draw, what's now going to happen? Can you see I've actually only painted where the image is not black. So essentially this texture mask is actually using a grayscale, like a black and white version, and where the image is white or is bright, I can paint on. Everything that's black, I can't paint on. It's also got transparency around the edges, so I can't see that either. Now this cat image, because it has color, doesn't quite make sense as a texture mask, though you can obviously use it. So let's add another one. If you click on this texture mask, right now I only have this texture available. So let's come down to the bottom, click this little duplicate icon here to create a new texture. Let's call this one Tribals. Come into the texture properties. On the brush, let's click on this and select Tribals. Right now that's an image or movie, it's black. So if I now click and paint, I can't actually paint because wherever this image is black, I can't paint on. So again, another reason why you might not be able to paint. But under the image settings, let's hit open. Under footage, textures, I'm going to select this Tribals image here. Let's return to our active tool. Come down a little bit. Our texture mask is now set to, yeah, see, you've got this in twice and it's a bit weird. What's happened is that under texture, it for some reason also selected this tribal image. So I want to remove this from the texture, close this. And now I've just got this stencil right there. And now let me hold down Alt Option and Shift, right click and scale this up. F, make my brush a little bit smaller. And now I can essentially kind of paint this tribal icon on, or this tribal imagery on. So that looks all right. So now I've painted some tribals on. But the image is the wrong way around, right? I kind of want to paint the pattern, not necessarily everything around it. Let's undo that. And there's a really nice way to do this. On the left-hand side, in the image editor, let's open up our tribals PNG. Zoom out a little bit. And let me actually disable the mapping to, from stencil to view plane, just so it doesn't pop over everything. So wherever it's black, we can't paint. Where it's white, we can paint, but we want it the other way around. So simply come up into image, and I'm going to go invert image colors. That's just going to invert the image. So now if I return to my 3D view or my texture pane view, let's come over here. Let's change this mapping from view plane back to stencil. The preview hasn't updated yet. If you go to texture paint, select that tribals brush again, that'll update here. And if you now return to the active tool and come down, let's again remove it from texture because again, Blender has reassigned it to texture as well. And in my texture mask, I don't know why this isn't updating, but you can see the preview has already updated. So if you now go in here, let me select maybe a black color this time. So let's go with a dark black. I'm actually just going to paint over this tribal icon here in the middle. So you can see I'm only painting on where that image is black. If I now remove this or set this to view plane, I've now painted this tribal icon or this tribal logo on. And again, you can kind of obviously adjust it to whatever size you want to kind of match what you're looking for to paint onto your 3D object. Let's remove the stencil or the texture mask. And yeah, this is a really nice way to kind of paint colors, textures, images, or patterns onto your 3D objects. Now, the last thing I want to show you is just that you can paint more than just the base color of your materials. On the left-hand side, let's just reselect this top base color layer just so you can see what we've painted. You can see all of the cat images as well as the tribals having been painted in here. And yes, the UVs we can see are only the ones that we have selected. So if you go to edit mode, we only have the ring selected now. So press A, select everything. You can see all of the UVs again. Tap back out into texture paint mode. Let's reselect this Pokeball top image layer. And right now, for example, you can see that it is uniformly shiny or uniformly rough. It doesn't have a lot of roughness, which is why it's very reflective. The cool thing is with this Pokeball top layer selected, you can actually hit plus under the textures and select to paint on the specular, roughness, metallic, normal, bump, or displacement layers. So let's say we want to paint on the roughness. I'm just going, I don't think it needs to be quite that big, so maybe I'll give this a 2000 by 2000. Hit OK. By default, that should look pretty much the same. If you go into the material properties, come down now, you should see that the roughness property now actually comes from an image, which is our Pokeball top roughness image. And if you return to the brush tool, with the Pokeball top material selected, you can now change whether you want to paint on the base color layer, you can see a change here, or on the roughness layer, which is kind of this color here. So if I now select maybe well, the black color is not too bad. So F, make that brush a bit bigger, Shift and F, left, make it a bit less opaque. If I now paint black into the middle here, that's going to make it more shiny. Now, it's hard to see, so let's actually change this color to white. Click and draw. This looks much better. Can you see how, well, the color is still the same, but it looks really dull. It's because now the roughness of this material is controlled by this roughness texture that we have right there. So maybe Shift and F, make this a little bit weaker. So I can now essentially paint rough patches onto my surface. The cool thing is this works really well with texture masks. Let's not use the tribals. Let's actually create a new texture mask. Let's call this one, maybe we'll go with Voronoi. Come into textures, under the brush, let's select a Voronoi, change the type over to Voronoi. Distance metric, Minkowski 4 maybe, and you can do, just play around with some of this stuff. Just to make this nice and detailed. I want it quite small, quite noisy to be honest. Again, just tweak this in any way that you want. You can give it a bit more contrast. Let's return to the active tool. We don't need it selected as a texture, so unselect that. We don't want to transfer it, we just want the texture mask. The mapping I'm going to set to view plane. You can also set it to random if you wanted to. You can now click and draw. Actually, you know what, let's swizzle this. Change my primary color to black so I can paint both. So let's paint with the black, Shift and F. Let's make this a bit more opaque as well. Let's paint that on. Is that just too small? It's a bit too small, I think. So let's come back into the texture, reselect our Voronoi texture here, maybe make it just a bit brighter as well. And I might make it a bit bigger. I think it's a bit too small actually to see. Come back to the tool. Yep, that looks all right. Again, texture, remove it from the texture. I don't want it there, I just want it on the texture mask. Let's actually set it to tiled. Click, and let's paint. Shift and F, let's make the opacity a bit bigger. So let's just paint a little bit here. Control or Command and click to paint with the other color. And you can now see what we're doing is we're essentially just painting this roughness on, and we're using a texture mask to get it a little bit of a pattern. So you kind of add this really nice irregularity to some of your materials. And you can do the same with specular, with bump mapping, with all sorts of other things. So you can add all sorts of roughness, patches, scratches, anything to your 3D models. Play around with this. There's a million options, but I just wanted to quickly show you how you can paint on different types of layers within the same material. And as I said, in this material mode, you can actually paint on quite a few different ones if you wanted to. So add them, have fun with this. There's a lot you can do. And as I said, if you do get stuck anywhere, either leave me some comments, questions, anything you want down below. I'm usually pretty responsive, although there's been a lot of spam on YouTube lately. But if for whatever reason you can't paint, you can't follow this tutorial properly using the files that I've provided, do make sure that you come into File, Defaults, load your factory settings, so clear all of the any settings under texture or under your advanced, or maybe you've got a stroke enabled that only paints every 1,000 stroke, or the sizing of it isn't matching your 3D model, so that doesn't work. Then do make sure you have your UVs set up properly. And again, if you don't know how to do UV mapping, it is part of my beginner course that I've got available on my website for free. So go and check that out if you're just getting started with that. Once you've got your UVs set up properly, you should be able to add textures to your materials, have those materials assigned to your 3D models. And again, if you don't know how that works, check out my beginner course. I can't say it often enough because people just jump into these tutorials without knowing the basics and then get stuck on the basics. So do make sure you check that out first. Again, as I said, it's completely free. So once your materials are assigned, you can assign the images into the slots or into the different channels and properties on your material, and then you can paint on them, and that then feeds into your final look. And with that, let's wrap this up. I hope this video was still helpful, even though the format was a little bit different. And that's all there is to it. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and please don't forget to like and subscribe if you would like to see more. Any comments, questions, or suggestions, leave them down in the comment section below. Also, please let me know how you like this format of content. It's a little bit more raw, a little bit less edited, a little bit less formal. But again, with my time constraints right now, it's a bit challenging to put my usual amount of time into every single video. I just want to make more content and put some new stuff out for you a little bit more frequently. But with that, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.